Speaking of which, what is Sullivan doing? I have hard time to understand the goal of his visit to China because first of all, this is his first trip to China. He met Wang Yi many times, like 5 times before this, but he never been to China during the trip, during the Biden's term. So this is his first time. But Biden is leaving and he's not running for re-election. What exactly Sullivan's goal here?
I think that Jake Sullivan is not going to be reappointed National Security Advisor by Kamala Harris. I mean, she's made that very clear. If she's elected in November, Sullivan's time as National Security Advisor is coming to an end. Apparently, they don't get on, and she's got her own team anyway. So I think what Sullivan is currently doing is he's trying to protect his legacy, his reputation. Now, there was a massive article in the Financial Times just a couple of days ago, which discussed Sullivan's approaches to China in the period between the balloon incident, the one where the United States was shooting down a Chinese weather balloon and getting utterly hysterical about it, and the San Francisco summit. And this article was very much praising Jake Sullivan, trying to make him out to be this great genius of diplomacy. And it spoke about the work he did trying to repair the relationship with China, to try to persuade the Chinese to come to San Francisco and to have negotiations there. And as I said, it was all about making him look better than he really is, in my opinion. Now, the thing to say is, with Sullivan, he does have enough understanding to understand one thing, which is that the single most important relationship in the world today, certainly for the United States, is the one with China. And apparently, he went against the wishes of some people like Blinken, for example, who were apparently fairly comfortable with a very bad relationship with China. So Sullivan did understand that he needed to have a dialogue with China. And he sought to develop a connection to Wang Yi, who he clearly sees as the man who he could speak to and understand and get the whole relationship on track. But of course, he is working or was working before the San Francisco summit from a completely wrong premise. He was assuming that the Chinese didn't want a dialogue with the United States and that it was for the Americans to persuade the Chinese to conduct a dialogue. Whereas the Chinese have never refused a dialogue with the United States. So the door that he opened, which he thinks is his great achievement, was in fact always open. It was not really, achieving an opening of the door. He wasn't really setting up the scene for the San Francisco summit, because the Chinese were always up for that. But nonetheless, he meets Wang Yi. He says all the things that we read in the media, that China and the United States, competitors on some things, but they can cooperate on others. Taiwan, we don't really have any objectives with respect to Taiwan. Trying to get the Chinese to make all kinds of concessions on every other single topic that you can imagine in the relationship. And the invariable thing that happened, this is from the Financial Times article, is that Wang Yi came back and said to him exactly the same things that Wang Yi is saying in public. It's very interesting. The Financial Times article confirmed that what China says in private to American diplomats is the same as what China says in public. So we don't have to, interpret or go behind the words and try to understand things. So the Chinese, Wang Yi would say, look, what we want is not this situation where, you cooperate with us when you want to and compete with us when you also want to. And that doesn't work like that. We have to be partners. We have to have a constructive, positive relationship with each other. He made it absolutely clear that with Taiwan, there is no room for compromise on China's part. The sovereignty issue is absolutely clear. There's no issue about this. Taiwan is Chinese territory. On the economic issues, of course, China was interested in talking with Jake Sullivan about economic issues, but they would have been interested in that anyway. And still, they were saying to the US, the drift of your trade policy is all wrong. It's only creating problems for you, even, of course, as it creates problems for us. And of course, the latest one that they've been bringing up increasingly is Russia. And the Financial Times article shows again that on the relationship with Russia, Wang Yi and China refused to give an inch. All that they said publicly is again the same as what they were saying privately. But I get the sense that this is the topic that Jake Sullivan now wants to go and talk about. He's going to go to Wang Yi and he's going to ask for the 101th time to get the Chinese to do something about their relationship with Russia. So, he understands how important this relationship is. He understands how important keeping, an open communication line with China is. But he doesn't come with anything that the Chinese and the Americans can work on and build on together.
I haven't read that article. I will, but my guess is that they never brought up the Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. That's my guess. Now, if the article saying, okay, China closed all the doors and for negotiation, well, that happened after the visit by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan.
Yeah.
China shut
Yes.
down the high level communication, in particular
Yes.
military, with the
Yes.
United States. And of course, nobody mentioned that. The mainstream media, they always say, oh, China doesn't pick up the phone. China, refused to do this and that. They
Yeah.
never said all these things happened after Nancy Pelosi's visit to
Yes.
Taiwan.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. He does. The Financial Times article, in fact, does touch on the Nancy Pelosi visit and admits what an utter disaster it was. But again, one doesn't get the sense that the Chinese were locking the door and saying we refuse to talk. It wasn't anything like that. On the substance, the Chinese position remains completely clear. And they've never shifted from it, either in public or in private. And again, it's very interesting reading the Financial Times article and seeing how the Americans think, because for them, it's the process, it's the performance seems somehow more important than the substance. The actual question of how we move forward with this relationship, and the Americans don't seem to get this at all. There was a comment in it which left me absolutely gasping, which apparently Jake Sullivan convinced himself, and the Financial Times agrees that the Chinese want to talk to the Americans about Taiwan because they understand that the Americans have more influence over the Taiwan separatists than China does. Of course they do. They have created the Taiwan separatists. Again, it shows something about the way in which these people perceive the world that is really very remarkable.
And is more intellectual than other people probably, and that's why Financial Times and the other media, I find that they like to talk him up. He's really this wonder boy, Rhodes Scholar, etc. So they tend to do that.
Yeah.
But let's just look how practical he is, because let's do a recap for what happened before his trip. Okay, he clearly has some goal. He wants to achieve something for his trip. Well, here's just a few things happened. I think a week or two before his visit, uh, a few weeks ago, the US Air Force sends a B-2 Spirit stealth bombers to Australia. Okay.
Mhm.
And then followed by Austin and Blinken's visit to the Philippines. After their visit, guess what? The Philippines Coast Guard ship entered the disputed waters with China and hit Chinese Coastal Guard ships. So,
Mm.
okay, there's a conflict there. And then Nikki Haley, the former ambassador to UN, visited Taiwan. Why does she need to visit Taiwan? I don't know.
Yeah.
And then Taiwan's foreign minister, the so-called foreign minister, Joseph Wu, visited Virginia. Now,
Mm.
my understanding at the high level, Taiwan's ministers cannot get into Washington, D.C. area, but they are on the outskirts. So the Virginia is where as close as they can get to Washington, D.C. And
Mm.
what they were discussing, nobody knows. It's a very kind of low profile, secretive visit, but people know that. And on top of that, Sullivan himself, before he landed in Beijing, he did a quick visit to Canada, Halifax, and talked to Trudeau. And shortly after that, Trudeau came out, announced, oh, 100% tariff to Chinese EVs, even
Mm.
though Canada has no EVs from China, all right, but 100% tariffs and sanctioned a bunch of Chinese
Mm.
companies, etc. You see, this is how the U.S. conducted diplomacy. Before his trip to China, clearly he wants to achieve something. They just created crisis after crisis and humiliate and punish China one after another. This is how they conduct their diplomacy,
Well,
right?
this is exactly correct. I mean, at the same time, what he wants to do when he meets China, when he meets Wang Yi and people like that, is he wants to string them along. He wants to tell them, look, but apparently, I mean, his complaint with Blinken was that Blinken is far too abrasive and rude, whereas Sullivan, with his diplomatic language and his nice manners and all of that, I mean, it treats Wang Yi as if he was a fool, and that Wang Yi and the Chinese don't understand and see what's really going on. And that's the trouble, because you're absolutely correct, because the drift of US policy remains in the same direction. It remains in the direction of confrontation. So yes, the Chinese do not want to see do not want a confrontation with the United States. Why would China want a confrontation with the
Yeah,
United States? It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. So they don't want a confrontation with the United States. They try to talk with the United States. They try to come to some kind of understanding with the United States. And what happens instead is that people like Sullivan and Biden and the others come along and lie to them, because that is what it amounts to. And the result is that confidence evaporates. I don't think there's very much of it left any longer. The Chinese continue to do what they can, but at the same time, they're taking precautions. They're building up their foreign currency and gold and raw material reserves. They're stopping antimony exports. They're building up their military forces because they can see that the storm's coming.
yeah. And the other thing, he wants something from China, but he doesn't show uh, any sincereness. The only
No.
thing he did was, like you said, he's probably more nicer in terms of his expression.
Yeah.
Is he did say one China policy. He did emphasize that.
Yeah.
But they always say that. They always say they respect
No.
one China policy, but then they do things differently. And this is not just about China. They always say, oh, Ukraine is a sovereign country, but we all know who's in control of Ukraine, right?
Mm.
Ukraine can make up its own mind, making its own decision. And we want, negotiation, we want peace. In reality, whenever Russian and Ukraine was closer to a peace deal, they would sabotage that. So
Mm.
they always say one thing, okay, we respect
Mm.
the one China policy, but you look at all the things they've done just recently, it's not helping the one China policy at all. right?
Yeah, well, of course it's not. I mean, if you want an even better parallel, it's with the Minsk agreement that was supposed
Hmm.
to be as the way in which you would sort out the problems in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine. And I can remember meeting after meeting with Russian and American officials and European officials, and the Americans and the Europeans always would say that we support the Minsk agreement. That's the only pathway towards peace, that it has to be implemented in full. And we now know, because they've admitted it, they don't even hide it any longer, that they were undermining it all along, and that they were trying to find ways, that they were using it basically to string the Russians along. So it's exactly the same, and it's a very, very bad approach. It's a disastrous way to conduct diplomacy. One of the oldest European handbooks on diplomacy was written by a French diplomat of the 18th century called Caillère, who was one of Louis XIV's diplomats. And he said that whatever else you do in a negotiation, never lie, always be honest. Um, you might gain a temporary advantage by your lie, but in the end, all you will do is leave poison behind you.
And and the Mearsheimer, I think he said that, right? Or one of his book, he said that. He said, well, leaders, they sometimes they lie to their people, but they don't lie to each other. You know, countries' leaders, right? They don't lie to each other. That's what you're not supposed to do that. But the
No.
US seems leaders do lie to other countries' leaders, right?
Well, it's become compulsive. They do so all the time, and as I said, it's destroyed the relationship with Russia completely,
Hmm.
and it's likely to destroy the relationship with China before
Hmm.
very long, unless there is a radical change in the US, which I have to say I think is very unlikely.
Yeah, I don't see that's happening either.
Mm.
And also in the Chinese media, the I actually see that in the West media mentioned a little bit in the midst of all this, right? Somehow that one of his old goals also to set up some kind of a summit between Xi Jinping and Biden. Now, preferably even a possible Biden trip to China. We talk about this that Biden never visited China during his term, right? Which is a first after China
Mm.
US established a diplomatic relationship. So I don't know why. And they even said probably after the election. So I don't know why he needs to visit China after his election, but after the U.S. election. But that's one thing that people are saying. And if he cannot make a trip, well, at least a video conference of some kind of a
Mm.
summit between the two leaders. Do you think that's part of it? I think one of the places mentioned that.
I think it's highly likely. If you go back
Okay.
to the Financial Times article, the entire objective of Sullivan's interactions with Wang Yi was to try to arrange a summit meeting between Biden and Xi. Now, the point is that at no point does Sullivan seem to have asked himself, what is the purpose of this meeting?
Exactly.
What are we going to get from this meeting? The mere fact of having a meeting was apparently, enough.
Mhm.
And it's all this is a performative. It's all about process. It's never really about addressing the substance. It's about having a meeting between Biden and Xi, and Sullivan can then go and say, "Look, I was the genius who arranged it." And to the extent that it has a purpose, it's to string the Chinese along a few months more, because that's all it can do.
Do you want to hear a cynical explanation by the Chinese netizens? They always have good
Yeah.
theories about things. So one of the commentator, I hear probably more than one, they're saying, okay, you know what Sullivan's doing here. Remember when Pompeo, when he left office, he was sanctioned by the Chinese government.
Mm.
And it actually has effect on him because he was originally planned to work for the Koch brothers,
Mm.
very high paid job. But the Koch brothers, being this huge international conglomerate, energy company, etc., they cannot upset China, so they cannot hire him. So as a result of that, Pompeo didn't get that cushy job. He ended up in a think tank. So some people are saying, well, maybe Sullivan want to get a good relationship, before leaves. Like you said, it doesn't seem like he's going to be reappointed by Harris, and certainly Trump wouldn't appoint him to anything.
No.
And so maybe he's preparing for some kind of a cushy job and doesn't want China to upset too much with him. And I would say, well, if that's the case, I actually think there might be some elements of that. He's trying to get a decent relationship with China before leaving.
Uh,
And if that's the case, it could also be even Biden wants to do that because Biden himself not interested, but his children, his grandchildren, his relatives, they might want to work in some kind of a international corporation, cushy jobs. Maybe they're all trying to, before leaving the office, have a good term with China. Is that a possibility?
I think it's not only a possibility. I wonder whether this particular netizen has actually hit the nail on the head, as we say in Britain. It could very well be exactly what it's all about. You come along, you tell everybody, look, I'm Jake Sullivan. I'm the person who knows how to speak to the Chinese. I've had this excellent relationship with Wang Yi. I get on with the Chinese. I'm able to talk to them. We have all these difficult things, but you see, I've even managed to set up 2 summits between the Chinese and the American presidents. So, of course, if you are a big multinational American conglomerate with lots of interests around the world who wants to do business also with China, I'm absolutely the man for you because you see, I've got all of these wonderful contacts and understandings in China. So, of course, he doesn't want to spoil that. And of course, he doesn't want to be sanctioned. So I would not be surprised at all if that is exactly what this is. And again, if you're talking about members of Biden's family, as we know very well, some of them did very well from business with China, and no
Mhm.
doubt they want to return to doing that.
Yeah,
The Biden himself, I suspect, is really out of the picture. But
yeah,
if they
yeah.
can wheel out the old man, get him to Beijing, they can all go with him and hope that something will come of it. What the Chinese make of all of this, because I am sure, by the way, I mean, bear in mind, they've met with all of these people. By now, they will have figured it out. What they make of it all, I wonder, actually.
Yeah, yeah. These people are so Nancy Pelosi, his own family, his son, his
Mm,
husband, they all have done business with China. They made big
I know.
money out of it. On the
Mm,
one hand, she's doing all these things, irritates China. On the other hand, her family is collecting money there. It's so despicable for what they're doing. If China's such a threat, why do you allow your families to do business with China? It doesn't make any sense,
absolutely.
right?
Well, it not only does it not make sense, it is completely hypocritical and completely
Yeah,
dishonest.
yeah, yeah,
Just saying.
yeah, absolutely.